Hey everybody. So the purpose of this mini lecture is just going to be to go through the events of the Watergate scandal in 1974. This was one of those historical events where if you were living through it at the time, it just felt like new things were happening every day. It felt very confusing and hard to deal with. And I think it can sometimes feel that way when we try to read about it as well, because there were just so many events. And so what I'm going to try and do here is break that down into a narrative that is easy to follow, that hits some of the high points, the most important points. As usual, I am not looking for you to memorize all of the details here. Instead, I want you to get a general sense of what happened. And I want you to think about what you would have felt if you were living through this time period. If you had been a normal American citizen, how would this have made you feel about the government? If you were a member of the House of Representatives and you were going to have to vote on impeachment, would you have voted to impeach the president? And if you had been a member of the Senate, thinking that you might end up having to vote whether to remove the president, do you think you would have voted to remove? So I want you to think about all of that as we go through, and that's what we'll do. All right. So, as you already know, President Nixon won the presidency, won a second term in 1972 in the largest landslide in US presidential history. He won every state in the Union except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. This was an election that was really hotly contested. People felt like the United States was divided as never before. We've heard some of this rhetoric in our lifetimes, but this idea that there were two Americas, really far left and a really far right, made people really uncomfortable, made people feel like the nation was something that they didn't recognize anymore. And so we know that Nixon was sort of the leader of this new kind of conservative movement under the Republican Party, that he had helped to create this new conservative coalition as the Democratic Party was splitting between a more conservative South and a more liberal North. He ran against a guy named George McGovern, who was himself pretty moderate, but who became associated in the media with the far left. And so you see him here with anti-war protesters, and he really got painted with this brush of being like a super far left radical kind of guy. Because this was sort of the tone of the election, I also wanted to share with you some of Nixon's campaign badges. He is named Richard Nixon, but he goes by Dick, and put out a lot of, or sanctioned the putting out of a lot of surprisingly vulgar campaign slogans, and this too. And so I'm not going to read those to you, but I thought you would be interested to know this is kind of surprising historical rhetoric, but this is sort of where we were at in 1972. All right, so the Watergate scandal began before the election in 1972, and people were sort of vaguely aware of it before the election, but it didn't seem to have much of an effect on how people voted. So in June 1972, on June 17th, 5 men broke into the Watergate Hotel, which was the Democratic campaign headquarters. And this is the Watergate Hotel here. It is a strange sort of C shape. And they broke in essentially to steal campaign secrets and to plant a listening device. And the listening device looked like this. We can see it's a time of very different technology. So there were microphones inside those chapsticks, and then they would have had to run the wires sort of out the back of the dresser and plug them in order to be able to listen. One of the reasons that they were caught was that they put tape on the latch of the door so that the door wouldn't be able to latch. They'd be able to get in when they were trying to break in. And they didn't fully successfully remove that tape. This just always sort of makes me laugh a little bit because I remember learning that trick, the tape trick, in a Nancy Drew novel. And the fact that that was being used by government operatives, or at least Nixon operatives, I think is really funny. So the story broke because of two reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who began reporting on the Watergate break-in as soon as it happened, and who quickly were approached by a secret informant who called himself Deep Throat. Nobody knew who he was at the time. In the early 2000s, he kind of came out and said who he had been, and it turned out it was Associate FBI Director Mark Felt, but no one knew this at the time. Also, I should say, this became such a big deal that it got turned into a huge Hollywood movie called All the President's Men. And this picture of Woodward and Bernstein is actually Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford from that movie. This is the actual Woodward and Bernstein. So usually when I teach this in person, some people are already giggling at the Deep Throat. And I want you to know that that had the same connotations in the 1970s that it does today, as a slang for a blowjob. And in fact, it was even more commonly used in the 1970s because the movie Deep Throat had just been released. It was one of the first sort of pornographic erotic films. It was the first, pornographic erotic film to get a wide theatrical release, which was a very big deal, was widely reported on. And so it was very strange that that was the name of the informant. And it kind of contributed to the ability of some people to not take this very seriously at first, because it seemed odd. It seemed a little bit strange. So Woodward and Bernstein are reporting on this beginning in June, but people are mostly not taking it seriously. They don't have a ton of concrete evidence. And so the election comes in November, and as we know, Nixon wins in a landslide. By February 1973, so by the month after the second inauguration, which happened in January, they start to have more concrete evidence, and there starts to be more and more evidence piling up that not only did this break-in happen, which everyone knows, but that the break-in may have been ordered by the president, which would mean that the president and his close associates were directly involved in trying to cheat in the election. So we begin the first step of a potential impeachment process, which is a congressional investigation into the Watergate break-in. And crucially, what is at issue here is the question of when Nixon knew that this was happening. So we know that this definitely happened, and we know that at some point Nixon knew about it, because by now everybody knows about it. But Nixon says he wasn't told until the day after his second inauguration. So he wasn't told basically until there was nothing he could do about it. He'd already been inaugurated. His hands are clean. And Congress is trying to figure out if that's true, and if that's true, who ordered the break-in and who is complicit in this cheating scandal. The big break in the case comes when it is discovered that Nixon has been recording most of what has been going on in the White House, in the Oval Office, while he's been president. And this comes out because during the congressional investigation, a lot of the Nixon aides and confidants who are giving testimony are able to recall word for word, with very precise certainty, what happened on particular days and what was said months ago. Which is very, very strange, right? Normally people are able to say, oh, I had a conversation and I think we said something like this, and it must have been around February, I don't know. that is a normal kind of testimony. In this case, people were saying, on February 6th, I said this, and the president said that. And people became suspicious, and eventually one of the congressional investigators said, are there tapes? How do you know this? Are there tapes? And the aide that they asked was so certain that President Nixon was innocent that he had no hesitation. He said, yeah, there are tapes, and you should get them. And he was sure that that would exonerate the president. As we are going to find out, the president was not innocent, and he was furious. He knew that these tapes would implicate him, that they would prove that he was not innocent. And so he spent the next several months fighting in the courts to try and keep these tapes from falling into the hands of the congressional investigators. He made the argument that national security would be at risk. He made a lot of other legal arguments. But eventually, Congress got their hands on the tapes. First, they were able to see just transcripts of the tapes, and eventually they got all of the tapes except for some sections that had been mysteriously erased. And from these tapes, we find out that Nixon actually knew about the Watergate break-in before the break-in happened. So this is the damning evidence that Congress has been looking for that proves that Nixon at least condoned the break-in. He at least knew about it and didn't try to stop it. So now it's October of 1973, and a very weird thing happens, which is that Vice President Spiro Agnew has to quit the vice presidency, not because of the Watergate scandal, which he was probably implicated in, but because of corruption and tax evasion that happened while he was the governor of Maryland. And so in the middle of this corruption investigation of the president, the vice president has to resign and face charges on corruption in a totally separate case, which just is kind of mind-blowing even now. But imagine being an American in 1974 and seeing this kind of corruption at both the presidential and vice presidential level. So shortly after that, a special prosecutor, Prosecutor Cox, is hired. The Congress really tries to hire someone who will be seen as nonpartisan, who will be seen as fair by both Republicans and Democrats. Nixon is furious. He does not care who the special prosecutor is. He doesn't think there should be a special prosecutor, and he demands that the special prosecutor be fired. The president does not have the power to fire the special prosecutor. That is a check and balance that is built into the system. But he does have the power to fire the attorney general, who is the boss of the special prosecutor. And so Nixon demands that Attorney General Richardson fire the special prosecutor. Attorney General Richardson refuses, and Nixon forces him to resign. Then he raises the deputy attorney general to the position of attorney general and demands that he fire the special prosecutor, and that new attorney general refuses. And so Nixon forces him to resign. At this point, the special prosecutor also resigns. And so this is something that's known as the Saturday Night Massacre. On a weekend, overnight, the president essentially fires two attorneys general and the special prosecutor hired to investigate him. Technically, they all resigned, but they resigned because they were forced out. So this, again, is seen as a new kind of level of corruption. Although, I should say, Nixon is still really popular among his supporters at this time. So people who didn't like him don't like him even more and feel like they have a ton of evidence for why they don't like him. People who felt kind of wishy-washy about him before are starting to feel like maybe he's not the greatest guy. But a lot of people love Nixon. He's a very charismatic president, and those people still really support him. They see this as a witch hunt. And so from February 1974 to August 1974, impeachment proceedings continue to happen in the House of Representatives. In March, 7 Nixon aides are indicted, so they aren't impeached. Impeachment is a process for bringing charges against an elected official. These aides were hired by the Nixon administration. They're not elected. And so actual criminal charges are brought against them in a court of law in March. In April 1974, the edited transcripts of the Nixon tapes are released to the public. So Congress has had access to these transcripts since 1973, but they are released at this point to the public, partly because Nixon is still so popular among his supporters that this is seen as sort of giving some of the evidence to the American people that Congress is looking at. And one of the things that comes out in these transcripts is the president's vulgarity. And so we saw some of that with the campaign buttons. That's why I showed them to you. But it turns out that Nixon, who has in a lot of ways presented himself as kind of a family man, as just like a really nice guy, swears like a sailor and uses every manner of racial slur that you can imagine. Literally, I learned new racial slurs by reading the transcripts. He is very creative in both his vulgarity and his racism. And so for a lot of people who were still on the fence, this really turns them off, not necessarily because of Nixon's corruption, but because of his character. For others, it turns them off because they start to see the depth of his corruption. And for others, they still support him. They still see this as the unfair persecution of a president who does not deserve to be persecuted. Then in July 1974, the original tapes are released. And so one of the readings that you're going to do after this is going to talk about the difference between transcripts and tapes as historical sources. And so it's significant that both Congress and the American people had the transcripts first and the tapes next, because there are certain things you can't learn from transcripts that you can then learn from tapes. And the tapes were even more damning, especially because of the missing sections, which it's sort of easy to read over. Oh, there are missing sections when you read a transcript. But when you hear these erased sections, it really brought home for people that it seemed like Nixon was still, even in the midst of this, hiding things. He claimed that the erasure had happened by accident as a result of glitches in the technology while someone was trying to transcribe the tapes. But the fact that they cut out at the particular moments that they do made most people distrust that account. Most people felt that the tapes had probably been erased at key points on purpose. So going back to what we know about impeachment, in the House of Representatives, in order to get an impeachment vote, the House has to vote just a simple majority. You just need 50% plus 1. In the Senate, you need a 2/3 majority in order to actually remove the president from office. And an important thing to remember here is that Nixon would have been only the second president to be impeached, more than 100 years after President Andrew Johnson, who was the first. And in the House of Representatives, the Democrats, who are not Nixon's party, already have a simple majority. If this goes to an impeachment vote, he will almost certainly be impeached. I mean, he will certainly be impeached. There's really no question about that. It's a little bit less clear what would happen in the Senate. You need 67 senators to vote for impeachment, to vote for removal. And there are only 56 Democrats and 2 independents in the Senate. But by this time, with the evidence stacking up, there are enough Republicans turning against Nixon that it seems like a real possibility that he might be removed from the Senate. We still don't know if he would have been. We pretty much know he would have been impeached. But the fact that there was even a chance he might be removed was startling. So on August 7th, 1974, all of this has come out. Nixon vehemently says he will not resign. He will not resign. He's not guilty. We get his famous, "I am not a crook." By Friday, August 9th, 1974, he has resigned. One of the things that happened in the interim is that a lot of top Republicans, or a handful of top Republicans, including Senator Barry Goldwater, who had run for the presidency in 1964, came to Nixon's office and said, "You have to resign. For the good of the party, for the good of the nation, you have to step down so that the nation can get back to the business of the nation and so that the Republican Party isn't blown apart by this scandal." And so Nixon resigns. Ford, who was never elected, becomes president. Because remember, Ford was appointed after the elected vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign. So Ford was never elected, even as a vice president. He becomes president. And he immediately, almost as his first act in office, pardons President Nixon. Gives him a full pardon, because at this point, Nixon could still face criminal charges. The things that he is suspected of doing, that there is a lot of evidence that he did, were not just bad things for a president to do, but were actually criminal things. The nation, a lot of people in the nation sort of want to see Nixon actually brought to justice. They feel that he avoided justice by resigning before he could be impeached. But Ford pardons Nixon and says, we have to get back to normal. We have to take this out of our attention span. So people feel all kinds of ways about that, as you can imagine. But that is sort of generally a quick overview of the Watergate scandal, of what happened, of how people responded to it. I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments, and I will see you later. Bye.